more.
Slowly on the clutch.
And that pretty much sums up my initial impression of the 1300 GS. Thank you for attending my TED Talk. Jokes aside, the 2024 BMW R1300 GS is bloody wild and I don't want to waste any more time trying to introduce it. So let's get down to the important information. The BMW R1300 GS gets a 1300cc liquid-cooled flat twin engine with double overhead camshafts, putting out 145 horsepower at 7,750 RPM and an insane 149 Nm of torque at 6,500 RPM. At this point, I'm not even going to waste my breath discussing the 6-speed gearing on its cardan drive shaft, because without the dynamic traction control, I, in my naivety, would have probably flipped the thing moving off in first gear. The power is certainly excessive. There are a lot of safety features to prevent you from running into a wall when you first get on it if you're coming from a higher revving bike or a smaller displacement machine, and you certainly will get used to it. But A, the power comes shockingly early, and B, I have no bloody idea when I'll ever get to use most of it. But you know what? The 225 km/h claimed top speed is kinda a nice talking point for your chat group to hypothesize about, theoretically. They updated the frame with a stiffer chassis and new paralever and telelever suspensions. I personally have no frame of reference against the newer 1250 GS, but it is definitely miles better than what was on the dated 1200 GS. And if I consider it on its own merits, I think it is definitely set up more for road comfort than off-road capability from the factory. Rear paralever is spring preload adjustable, and the front and back overall get about 190 to 200mm of travel. Despite the weight and size, the 1300 GS is surprisingly agile on the road. I'm also often not particularly confident in making U-turns on expensive bikes that belong to someone else for fear of damaging it, but I think I handled it pretty well without resorting to pedaling like a duck. You get 19-inch front and 17-inch rear spoked aluminum cast wheels that can fit quite a large variety of dual sport tires, and they are outfitted with Michelin Anarchy Adventures from the factory, which, if you've watched my review on those, are seriously good for every kind of riding except the hardest mud tracks. It also sports 190mm of ground clearance, give or take depending on the load, which isn't really anything out of the ordinary for the product class. All in all, it's got on paper everything one needs to go off-road out the door, theoretically. You also get a hefty 19-litre fuel tank with a claimed efficiency of 18 km to a litre for a total of 342 km range if you ignore the reserve that comes on at 4 litres. I have tested it myself, but I'm not quite famous enough for performance models to feel safe in letting an 80 grand bike out their sight with me on it longer than 30 minutes, just like the other Joe Schmoes there for a test ride. Last bit on the performance. Brakes feel superb, not much pressure required from your fingers, and a lot of it boils down to the electronic braking assistance. Now fasten your seatbelts! This is usually the shortest segment in most review videos I do if I don't ramble about the instrument cluster. This time there won't be any rambling because I've got a whole list to go through. Even without any of the optional manufacturer equipment you still get: keyless ignition, heated grips, radar-based cruise control, dynamic traction control, dynamic brake control, hill start assistance, engine drag torque control, tire pressure monitoring and control, a smartphone charging compartment with USB socket, blind spot mirrors, fully integral ABS, 4 riding modes, that being Eco, Rain, Road and Enduro, and they are all controlled through a large and clear TFT display under various menus that can also be connected to your mobile phone through an app. I could go through and regurgitate every single sentence I can remember when the showroom salesman was explaining the menu to a gentleman who had just bought one of these, but it would add another 20 minutes to an already long video, and you're better off not thinking about it until you have to ride one. You also get a rear rack mount with the base trim, and of course it only accepts the magnetically secured BMW top and side luggages. What I don't appreciate is that the front turn signals are now integrated into the handguards. I don't expect anybody to actually take this off-road to need a more robust aftermarket set, but it just makes life a tad bit more difficult for those crazy enough to do so. I also don't appreciate how they've also dropped having separate brake lights in order to use integrated dual-purpose rear turn signals that double as brake lights when not using your indicators. This just makes it all the harder to use affordable aftermarket components once you are out of warranty. But hey, at least those turn signals have a smart cancel after you make a turn or ride with it long enough like you find in cars. As in many review videos, I've said that I weigh about 75 kilos and come in at 177 centimeters tall. The 1300 GS was very roomy for me by all metrics. I could reach the handlebars, foot pegs and leg controls without stretching myself. The stock clutch and brake levers were also adjustable to suit my finger length. The ride height was surprisingly comfortable. It didn't feel excessively tall in my opinion at 850mm, and the stock suspension setup had some give to handle road bumps but wasn't overly soft. But at the same time, what I didn't feel from the road I could get from the vibration of the massive engine in my hands. Thankfully, the radar-based cruise control is something that exists to alleviate that issue. I also found the gear selector to be superb. There is no need for your toes to move long distances. There is no faffing about trying to find neutral, and you can shift gears with very little pressure applied to the shifter. The wet weight is a hefty 237 kilograms wet. But if you consider that the 1250 GS that came before was a 249 kilogram pig, this is honestly a welcome change. The seat was suitably wide and comfortable for my inseam, and the material was plush and soft enough. However, there was a customer on the showroom floor that test rode the bike before me. He was roughly 6'2", coming from a 2019 1250 GS, and while he liked the bike, felt it was too cramped for him. To him, it was too slim and too short. My only problem would probably be the size of the hand controls and how many buttons there are. It's not a new issue with GSs, but the recently added rolling dial on the left-hand cluster made it very difficult for my small hands to reach several buttons on that side. And while they scaled the bike down a bit from the 1250 GS, the bike is still big. It's not particularly easy for a rider on one to dive between lanes on one of these. There are quite a few other manufacturer options like adaptive ride height and suspension, heated seats, and electronically controlled windshields you could pay more for, but I don't have much to say having not experienced them on the base trim. In terms of aesthetics, almost anyone who has been around BMW's GS long enough would notice by now how much of a drastic departure the 2024 R1300 GS has taken compared to the 1250 iteration before it. Many hated it when it first came out, and many also eventually got used to it. Before the 1300 came out in 2023, the GS of old, from the 1994 R1300 GS to the 2023 R1250 GS, had in the intervening 29 years been mostly small incremental changes. Now, the headlight and front assembly bears an incredibly striking resemblance to the Suzuki Katana, at least the new 2019 model. Now, this isn't particularly bad in my personal opinion, as I have always loved the original 80s Katana as well as its new iteration due to how futuristic and unique it looked. But I feel like BMW is just trying too hard to make it an expensive V-Strom. And I think that is the feel I'm getting from the 24 1300 GS. I get a very futuristic vibe from it. Something that would fit in very well in Tom Cruise's 2013 film Oblivion, or if the Kaminoans from Star Wars Episode 2 rode motorcycles. I appreciate how the front fender as well as side panels have been raised high and kept short to expose more of the front telelever suspension for viewers to appreciate the engineering behind it. And the middle section and tail are a bit more traditional in layout, though very neat, tidy and orderly, with BMW's distinctive lack of exposed mechanisms and minimal chrome, as well as solid panels to match the futuristic front. The cockpit of the old 1250 GS had always been teetering on feeling like you're in a car, but with the 1300 GS they've gone one step further and really closed up a lot of the gaps that would have let you see the wiring and front assembly componentry from the rider's seat. It in fact now really feels like you're driving rather than riding, with the sensory overload that comes with the TFT display, handlebar controls and the very car-like bar-mounted mirrors. But overall, in my opinion, the look and feel of the bike has an astounding level of premium polish and the build quality is amazing. Now, as of 1st of March 2024, the price of the base 1300 GS, the triple black, costs $79,800 in Singapore for the machine price, and it goes up to $84,800 for the most expensive option 719 trim. BMWs have traditionally never been affordable by any measure across its entire line. But to be honest, this is really pushing it. One of the customers at the showroom I spoke to reminisced about how the 1250 GS he bought way before the pandemic in 2019, quote, only cost him 55 grand. And I looked around the entire showroom floor and felt seriously out of place, being the only 35-year-old in a crowd of late 40s and 50-somethings doing senior management or C-suite roles. Even if you had the opportunity to test one and liked it for what it does, it often isn't reasonably within reach of the vast majority of the market, whether off the showroom floor or used. However, if you are somehow part of the 1% elite in Singapore that has absolutely no issue with the hefty price tag, the 1300 GS has got to be one of the most comfortable road touring bikes I've ever had the pleasure to test ride on. It's one of the most feature-rich machines in the market, with all sorts of electronic applications you can feasibly think of using and customizing it to your personal taste. It's got great polish, great performance all around, and actually relatively easy to get used to despite its power when coming from a smaller displacement motorcycle, once you get over the initial shock and push the cost of liabilities out of your mind and focus on having fun. But I'll be honest, BMW tries to shoehorn its appearance in off-road settings in its marketing material a lot, and I don't deny it has great torque and has a body shape that makes it relatively easy to pick up despite it weighing as much as an elephant. But who would seriously have the heart to do any of that on something that costs 90 grand or more all in? As As a YouTuber who enjoys getting the chance to test bikes out, I depend on staying on the good side, or at least under the radar of manufacturers like BMW and their local distributors to be allowed to do so again. But if I had the chance to give my feedback for the next iteration of the GSs being sold in Singapore, I'd have to say this to BMW. Don't get me wrong, even with what I had to say, the 1300 was a phenomenal bike to play with for 20 minutes. But please, dial it back down a bit with the excessive integrations that prevent owners from making modifications or repairs easily. And while I can understand the target demographic aren't exactly cash poor under 50s, the overly engineered and subsequently more expensive 1300 is still a tad bit excessive to even your most ardent fans and customers. So, owners of the BMW R1300 GS, what are your thoughts on the bike, and have I missed out any important points that should have been talked about? Leave them in the comments below. Stay safe, ride safe, and I'll see you next time. Peace out and bye bye.